Ministeriales were people raised up from serfdom to be placed in positions of power and responsibility. In the Holy Roman Empire, in the High Middle Ages, the word and its German translations, Ministeriale and Dienstmann, came to describe those unfree nobles who made up a large majority of what could be described as the German knighthood during that time. What began as an irregular arrangement of workers with a wide variety of duties and restrictions rose in status and wealth to become the power brokers of an empire. The ministeriales were not legally free people, but held social rank. Legally, the liege lord determined who they could or could not marry, and they were not able to transfer the lord's properties to heirs as spouses. They were, however, considered members of the nobility since that was a social designation, not the legal one. Ministeriales were trained knights, held military responsibilities and surrounded themselves with the trappings of knighthood, and so were accepted as noblemen. Both women and men held the ministerial status, and the laws on ministeriales made no distinction between the sexes in how they were treated. Origins to 11th century. The origin of the ministerial pedigree is obscure. A medieval chronicler reported that Julius Caesar defeated the Gauls and rewarded his Germanic allies with Roman rank. Princes were awarded senatorial status and the lesser knights received Roman citizenship. He assigned these knights to princes but urged the princes to treat the knights not as slaves and servants but rather to receive the services as the knights' lords and defenders. Hence it is, the chronicler explained, that German knights, unlike the counterparts in other nations, are called servants of the royal fisc in princely ministerials. Quote, in England there was no group of knights referred to as ministeriales, for the tight grip that English lords held upon the knights gave them less freedom than their German counterparts who had codified rights. Abbot Adelaide of Corbie was Emperor Charlemagne's chief advisor, and described the running of the government in his work De Ordine Palatii. There he praises the great merits of his imperial staff, made up of household servii proprii, who were the first ministerials authoritatively recorded. His letters specify that not only were they considered exceptional by the superiors, but the ministerials also mentored the successors in a form of administrative apprenticeship program. This may be the origin of ministerials as individuals in a set position. It was Emperor Conrad II who first referred to ministerials as a distinct class. He had them organized into a staff of officials and administrators. In documents they are referred to as ministeriales vir, or ministerial men. Ministeriales of the post-classical period who were not in the royal household were at first bondsmen or serfs taken from the servi proprii, or household servants. These servants were entrusted with special responsibilities by their overlords, such as the management of a farm, administration of finances or of various possessions. Free nobles disliked entering into servile relationships with other nobles, so lords of a necessity recruited bailiffs, administrators and officials from among their unfree servants who could also fulfill a household warrior role. For the 11th century the term came to denote functionaries living as members of the knightly class with either a lordship of their own or one delegated from a higher lord as well as some political influence. Kings placed military requirements upon the princes, who in turn placed requirements upon the vassals. The free nobles under a prince may have a bond of vassalage that let them get out of serving, so kings, princes, bishops and archbishops were able to recruit unfree persons into military service. Such a body made up the group called ministeriales. There were two sorts of ministerials: cazzati, who administered lands and estates for a legion, were paid from the proceeds of the land, and non-cazzati, who held administrative and military positions but were paid in either a fixed amount of coin or by a portion of the proceeds of mills, road or bridge tolls, or ferry fees or port taxes. 11th–12th centuries, as the need for such service functions became more acute and the duties and privileges, at first nebulous, became more clearly defined. The ministeriales developed in the Salian period into a new and much differentiated class. They received fiefs, which to begin with were not heritable, in return for which they provided knightly services. They were also allowed to possess, and often did hold, alads, ownership of real property that is independent of any superior landlord. But it should not be confused with anarchy, as the owner of allodial land is not independent of his sovereign. Ministerials were found holding the four great offices necessary to run a great household: seneschal, butler, marshal and chamberlain. They were vidama castellans, having both military and administrative responsibilities. Conrad II of Cutchul was the financial advisor to four archbishops over the course of 40 years. For the reign of Archbishop Conrad II they were employed as stewards, castellans and judges in the administration of the imperial territories, and in the lay principalities. As imperial ministerials they upheld the Salian, and particularly the Hohenstaufen, imperial polity. In the Archbishopric of Salzburg the ministerials and clergy together elected Archbishop Gebhard in 1060, as well as every archbishop from 1147 to 1256 save for Conrad III. Ministerials could be drawn from different occupational groups. In Salzburg, Austria, a timo appears in 1125/47 in the traditions, but as a miles of the archiepiscopal ministerialage who functioned as burgrave and also as a merchant. By the 12th century a distinction was made between greater ministerials who had their own vassals and lesser ministerials who had no vassals of their own. During the 12th century the old free nobility of Salzburg even found it a wise strategy to surrender the freedom in return for the safety of Salzburg's patronage. Around 1145, Ulrich I of the lesser noblesim's family chose to subjugate his household to the archbishop by marrying the Salzburg ministerial Liudgarda von Berg. The son, Ulrich II, was born into his mother's status, as was the practice. But now the Simses enjoyed the protection of one of the most powerful houses in the region. This was a wise strategy, considering the weak Simses were surrounded by greedy neighbors. By the end of the 12th century the term miles, theretofore reserved for free warriors, was also being applied to ministerials. Over the course of the 13th century their status was slowly assimilated to that of the free nobility, or vassals. The remaining traces of the taint of servility gradually faded, and the fiefs for service turned into proper hereditable fiefs, partly also because impoverished free nobles, while reserving the personal free status, voluntarily became ministeriales. 13th century onwards. By the 13th century Bavarian law held that the ministeriales held a position higher than the ordinary militares, and only the monarchy and princes were permitted to maintain ministeriales. Imperial courts increasingly rendered justice for ministerials, as when Count Frederick of Eisenberg murdered Archbishop Engelbert of Cologne in 1225. The archiepiscopal ministerials brought an appeal to the royal court to demand justice. The count's brothers, the bishops of Munster and Osnabrück, were brought before the court for complicity, and bloodshed at the court was narrowly averted. Count Frederick was convicted in absentia. All his ministerials were released from his service, and Frederick was captured and broken on the wheel. By the 13th and 14th centuries the ministeriales formed an intrinsic part of the lower nobility, and in the 15th century formed the core of the German knightly class. Other regions were not as open, for as late as the 15th century the documents of the Dutch province of Gelderland continued to distinguish between knights of noble and of ministerial birth. Certain vassal relationships, Social differentiation. Legally, a ministerial was a ministerial, bound by the rights and duties enumerated in their area. Socially, there was a distinction between the greater ministerials and the lesser ones in the order of precedence. Greater ministerials maintained their own subordinate milites, or armagerous soldiery. These could be either free knights or lesser ministerials like the wealthy widow Diemet von Hogel, who held 4 castles with ministerial chaplain, chamberlain and seneschal. The lesser ministerials were ones who held no subordinates at all, but rather held an office and may or may not have maintained arms and armor, uses and duties. As with all medieval terms of vassalage, the duties, obligations and benefits varied by region and even individual negotiation or tradition. These are often recorded in the Holy Roman Empire in a document named a Dienstract, or service code. Military. One constant is that all arrangements included a duty owed to the lord for military service. This could take the form of actual personal service by the Ministerialis or a payment to fund others who went to war. The monastery of Moormunster records the following: when a campaign of the king is announced to the bishop will send an official to the abbot, and the abbot will assemble his ministerialis. He will inform them of the campaign, and they will assemble the following men and equipment: 1 wagon with 6 cows and 6 men, 1 pack horse with saddle and equipment and 2 men, the leader and the driver. If the king moves the army to Italy, all the peasant farms shall contribute for that purpose the usual taxes. But if the army moves against Saxony, Flanders or elsewhere on this side of the Alps, only half that amount will be given. For these additional taxes the wagons and pack animals will be loaded with rations and other items necessary for the journey. In Bamberg, the Carolingian method of providing for a campaign remained in effect. Ministeriales were grouped into 3s. 1 went on campaign while the other 2 were responsible for equipping and victualling him. This ensured that those who were sent to war were prepared for war. This also shows that a military obligation didn't necessarily mean riding off with the army. The archbishops of Cologne differentiated between his poorer and wealthier vassals. Ministerials with an annual income of 5 marks or more were required to go on campaign in person, but those with smaller incomes were offered the choice to go on the march or to give half the income of the fief that year as a military tax. Administration. Ministerials fulfilled the range of offices that ran the lieges fiefs for them. They were found in the 4 traditional offices of a household: chamberlain, marshal, butler and seneschal. Conrad II von Kuchel served his succession of archbishop lieges as a financial advisor for 40 years. Werner von Lengfelden was master of Hohensalzburg castles Huschkirchen, and Ulrich II served as vidam of Salzburg in 1261, then, at various times, as marshal between 1270 and 1295, and as burgrave of Tutmaning in 1282. Ministerials could also be assigned to claim unused or poorly defended border areas, as with Lordag Castle and Hohenwerflen Castle. Trade and commerce. Greater ministerials considered themselves above trading in filthy money, as did many nobles of the era, but Fried notes a number of ministerials who couldn't afford to turn up their noses to income. Circa 1125, Timo served not only as the burgrave of Salzburg but also as a merchant of the city. Ordolf of Guy, also a Salzburger, brokered the produce of his own vineyards. Gerhowitsling even appeared as a Zeckmeister in Salzburg. Rights and restrictions. Nobility was a social distinction, so even the unfree ministerials were considered higher in precedence than a free commoner. Being of a noble estate, ministerials were exempt from the more odious of corvée duties that other types of serfs performed, though some lieges would reserve the right to commandeer plough teams and draft horses. places. Some ministerial women did perform household duties but were well compensated for the chores. Ministerials were serfs, and as such could not move without expressed permission of the lord or lady, though in certain clergy lands they could take holy orders without permission. Ministerials were in many places forbidden to marry without permission, but other places upheld Galatians chapter 3 verse 28 that says no one may be denied a sacrament because of one's legal status. If a liege disliked any marriage, though the liege could easily withdraw any lands or income held by his subject, any marriage was subject to review or approval of the liege, as in Salzburg. In July 1213, Archbishop Eberhard II of Salzburg and Bishop Manigold of Passau asked King Frederick II at the imperial court held at Eger to confirm the marriage contract that Gerhard II of Bergheim-Radeck, an archiepiscopal ministerial, had made with Bertha of Lonsdorf, a Passau ministerial. The couple had agreed, presumably with the lord's consent, that the first two children were to belong to Salzburg and the third to Passau, and that any remaining children would be divided equally between the two churches. Gerhard and Bertha could confer their allied on each other, and the children would share the paternal and maternal inheritances equally. The usual rule was that children of a mixed-status marriage would have the legal standing of the lesser of the parents. The child of a free knight and an unfree ministerial, therefore, was a ministerial. The liege of the mother would be the child's liege, for the child followed the womb.